Coming to you from the Forge of Freedom studio in the heart of America. A podcast dedicated to preserving freedom and inspiring personal success. Freedom is born and lives through you, the individual, and it dies in the shadows of tyranny. Motivating our listeners to become well-rounded, freedom-minded people with the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior. The tree of liberty lives on through you, the Forge of Freedom. And now here's your host, Alex Ooley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 50 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I'm going to discuss a topic that I studied quite extensively as an undergraduate student some years ago, the nature of evil, and specifically how the final solution was even possible in Germany during World War II. And I'm going to share, in large part, an article with you called Hannah Arendt's Chilling Thesis on Evil by Lawrence Reed. And Lawrence Reed is President Emeritus at FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education. You may recall that I had him on the show as a guest in episode 40 about his book, Are We Good Enough for Liberty? And if you didn't get to catch that discussion, I'll link to it in the show notes. I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that discussion with Lawrence Reed. I thought that was a great conversation, and I think you'll really enjoy that one. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. But I think it's instructive to share this article and to think about these things, how evil can seemingly seep into society and sneak up on us in a way. And I think it's instructive or useful to think about this with a mind toward preventing the reoccurrence of this phenomenon in the future. And it goes along with this idea that's captured in the saying about how if you know history, or if you don't know history, history will repeat itself. Or more precisely, as Edmund Burke put it, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And I think, and I'll come back to this again at the end, but I think this notion about knowing and being familiar with the mistakes and the history that we have access to is important because it helps prevent these sorts of atrocities in the future. And unfortunately, our education system is not doing a good job at teaching history. And unfortunately, a lot of the people my age, younger, even older in some cases, aren't familiar with the history and are susceptible to dangerous ideologies that lead down the path toward these sorts of atrocities. So with that said, here's the article, Hannah Arendt's Chilling Thesis on Evil by Lawrence Reed. And I'll link to this in the show notes along with that episode 40 that I recorded with Lawrence Reed, Are We Good Enough for Liberty? So let's get into the article here. 9 months after the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann died at the end of a noose in Israel, a controversial but thoughtful commentary about his trial appeared in The New Yorker. The public reaction stunned its author, the famed political theorist and Holocaust survivor, Hannah Arendt. It was February 1963. Arendt's eyewitness assessment of Eichmann as terribly and terrifyingly normal took the world by surprise. Her phrase, the banality of evil, entered the lexicon of social science, probably forever. It was taken for granted that Eichmann, despite his soft-spoken and avuncular demeanor, must be a monster of epic proportions to play such an important role in one of the greatest crimes of the 20th century. I was only following orders, he claimed, in the colorless, matter-of-fact fashion of a typical bureaucrat. The world thought his performance a fiendishly deceptive show, but Hannah Arendt concluded that Eichmann was indeed a rather ordinary and unthinking functionary. How callous, a betrayal of her own Jewish people. How could any thoughtful person dismiss Eichmann so cavalierly? Arendt's critics blasted her with such charges mercilessly, but they had missed the point. She did not condone or excuse Eichmann's complicity in the Holocaust. She witnessed the horrors of National Socialism firsthand herself, having escaped Germany in 1933 after a short stint in a Gestapo jail for anti-state propaganda. She did not claim that Eichmann was innocent, only that the crimes for which he was guilty did not require a monster to commit them. How often have you noticed people behaving in antisocial ways because of a hope to blend in, a desire to avoid isolation as a recalcitrant, non-conforming individual? Did you ever see someone doing harm because everybody else was doing it? The fact that we all have observed such things and that any one of the culprits might easily, under the right circumstances, have become an Adolf Eichmann is a chilling realization. As Arendt explained, going along with the rest and wanting to say we were quite enough to make the greatest of all crimes possible. Eichmann was a shallow and clueless joiner, someone whose thoughts never ventured any deeper than how to become a cog in the great historic Nazi machine. In a sense, he was a tool of evil more than evil himself. Commenting on Arendt's banality of evil thesis, philosopher Thomas White writes, Eichmann reminds us of the protagonist in Albert Camus' novel The Stranger, who randomly and casually kills a man, but then afterwards feels no remorse. There was no particular intention or obvious evil motive. The deed just happened. Perhaps Hannah Arendt underestimated Eichmann. He did, after all, attempt to conceal evidence and cover his tracks long before the Israelis nabbed him in Argentina in 1960, facts which suggest he did indeed comprehend the gravity of his offenses. It is undeniable, however, that ordinary people are capable of horrific crimes when possessed with power or a desire to obtain it, especially if it helps them fit in with the gang that already wields it. The big lesson of her thesis, I think, is this: if evil comes calling, do not expect it to be stupid enough to advertise itself as such. It's far more likely that it will look like your favorite uncle or your sweet grandmother. It just might cloak itself in the grandiloquent platitudes like equality, social justice, and common good. It could even be a prominent member of Parliament or Congress. Maximilien Robespierre and Louis Antoine de Saint-Just, I suggested in a recent essay, were peas in the same pod as Eichmann. Ordinary people who committed extraordinarily heinous acts. Hannah Arendt is recognized as one of the leading political thinkers of the 20th century. She was very prolific, and her books are good sellers still, nearly half a century after her death. She remains eminently quotable as well, authoring such pithy lines as political questions are far too serious to be left to the politicians. The most radical revolutionary will become a conservative the day after the revolution. And the sad truth of the matter is that most evil is done by people who never made up their minds to be or do either evil or good. Some of Arendt's friends on the left swallowed the myth that Hitler and Stalin occupied opposite ends of the political spectrum. She knew better. Both were evil collectivists and enemies of the individual. Hitler never intended to defend the West against Bolshevism, she wrote in her 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. but always remained ready to join the Reds for the destruction of the West, even in the middle of the struggle against Soviet Russia. To appreciate Hannah Arendt more fully, I offer here a few additional samples of her writings. The moment we no longer have a free press, anything can happen. What makes it possible for a totalitarian or any other dictatorship to rule is that people are not informed. How can you have an opinion if you are not informed? If everybody lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. This is because lies, by their very nature, have to be changed, and a lying government has constantly to rewrite its own history. On the receiving end, you get not only one lie, a lie which you could go on for the rest of your days, but you get a greater number of lies depending on how the political wind blows. And a people that no longer can believe anything cannot make up its mind. It is deprived not only of its capacity to act, but also of its capacity to think and to judge. And with such a people, you can then do what you please. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, i.e. the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, i.e. the standards of thought, no longer exist. The essence of totalitarian government, and perhaps the nature of every bureaucracy, is to make functionaries and mere cogs in the administrative machinery out of men, and thus to dehumanize them. The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. From the viewpoint of our legal institutions and our moral standards of judgment, this normality was much more terrifying than all the atrocities put together, for it implied, as had been said at Nuremberg over and over again by the defendants and their counsels, that this new type of criminal, who is in actual fact hostis generis humani, commits his crimes under circumstances that make it well nigh possible for him to know or to feel that he is doing wrong. Totalitarianism begins in contempt for what you have. The second step is the notion things must change no matter how. Anything is better than what we have. Totalitarian rulers organize this kind of mass sentiment, and by organizing it, they articulate it, and by articulating it, they make the people somehow love it. They were told before, thou shalt not kill, and they didn't kill. Now they are told, thou shalt not kill, and although they think it's very difficult to kill, they do it because it's now part of the code of behavior. The argument that we cannot judge if we were not present and involved ourselves seems to convince everyone, everywhere, although it seems obvious that if it were true, neither the administration of justice nor the writing of history would ever be possible. So there you have it. That's the article by Lawrence Reed, Hannah Arendt's chilling thesis on evil. And like I said at the beginning, I bring this article to you because I think it's instructive to think about where we are as a society. And I think it's easy to find examples of this sort of cog in the wheel experience. And I think we've seen it in our own generation, in our own lives. People who do things unthinkingly and without judgment because they lack the ability to think critically and they lack the knowledge to question what they've been told. And I think much of this stems from our government education system. And I'll be talking about this subject, our government education, more in the near future. And in fact, at the end of August, I have a few guests to talk about education in general, unschooling, homeschooling, and the government education system. And we'll talk about sort of the monstrosity that our government education has become. In 2020, only 12% of American high school seniors were proficient in U.S. history. Government school student proficient in history has been dropping consistently since 2014. Perhaps this low proficiency explains why many young people seem unable to recognize the flawed nature of ideologies that are infiltrating our society and our current thought patterns, or why they seem unable to exercise good judgment about current events. If they don't know what came before their lifetimes or the consequences resulting from those previous historical events, then how can we expect them to do anything except run with the crowd toward a multitude of evils? And if their mind cannot understand these things, then how can we expect them to elect or lead a government or a society that is anything but degenerate? The government school monopoly is an expensive failure. And as I said, I'll be discussing this issue more in upcoming episodes. But thinking back to history here, if Winston Churchill were commenting on America's current government school system instead of the Royal Air Force, he would have said, "Never have so many paid so much to achieve so little." And I say that because there are numerous charts, studies, data out there that show that with the increase in spending on government schools, we have level or even worse outcomes. So throwing money at the problem is not going to fix it. So with all this said, I think I wanted to point out, number one, Hannah Arendt's thesis here on evil, about how it can so easily grip society and so easily be carried out by terrifyingly normal people, terribly normal people, I think is very important to keep in mind, because we have to guard against that tendency. And we can only guard against that tendency if we teach people how to think critically, how to think independently, and if we teach them history. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed this discussion. I will link to the article in the show notes along with that episode 40 with Lawrence Reed. I'll also link to the book that was mentioned here, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is a book written by Hannah Arendt. I think is a really interesting book. I read this book in a seminar in undergraduate. It's an extremely interesting book, a lot of history about World War II and the aftermath, the Nuremberg trials, and so on. So that's an interesting book I'd encourage you to check out, and I'll link to that in the show notes. I'll also link to a few other articles by Hannah Arendt, number one, and then also there's a movie just called Hannah Arendt that I'll link to in the show notes as well. And then finally, I'll link to an article by Thomas White. What did Hannah Arendt really mean by the banality of evil? And I think he just basically expands on this idea that evil doesn't come, like was said in this article by Lawrence Reed, doesn't advertise itself as such. It comes in seemingly innocuous forms. And I think that evil is carried out every day in this way, not just during World War II, not just by the Nazis, but in every generation, and especially at the hands of government. So with that said, I hope you'll check out those resources. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. This episode was a little bit of a sad episode. I try to stay positive, but I think it's important, and I'll just cast this in a more positive light. I think that to maintain our freedom and to stand up against evil and the proliferation of evil in society, we have to know these things. We have to be aware of them. And by equipping ourselves with the knowledge, the history, we can maintain and preserve freedom, not only for ourselves, but for future generations. So until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter @ForgeOfFreedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.